I don't know. We should try it one of these times just to see, maybe in a
Uh,
lower stakes environment.
yeah.
Because the stakes for this are sky high.
If you screw up the live stream, Jeremy.
Lives are at stake. Hello, and welcome to episode 86 of the Following Mechanical Turks project. We're in the process of producing the third piece from the project, this one looking at the theoretical operations of Mechanical Turk and its ilk. So,
Mhm.
I was kind of talking to someone about this the other day, how, we've sidled up to other forms of human machine collaboration. I think that's kind of useful because it came out of our discussion last time, sort of, we kind of resolved a direction that I was like, well, how does this associate with, Mechanical Turk? I think kind of keeping that in mind will help us stay on track. I mean, I think we're
Yeah.
allowed to think of human machine collaborations broadly. Um, and it also, is building upon things we discovered in the previous pieces. But it's something to serve as a North Star, I guess.
Yeah, or at least how we're, looping back around in some way. And I think we are. I think what was interesting last time is how we were able to articulate some pretty strong through lines, I think. So um which isn't at all at odds with what we were originally interested in thinking about anyway. So
Um, I should put you on the spot and say what through lines are, because as we often tend to do, we kind of go off in a few different directions.
yeah.
Where do you see, what do you see as sort of the strongest themes
Well,
right
I
now, I think?
I think our original interest in using Taskscape as a way of understanding how human intelligence was being not just defined but generated.
Mm,
And I think that helped these this as we moved sort of away from Turk work in general and started looking at, human machine collaborations, but then also I think some of our more recent conversations about artificial intelligence and artifice is I think that original use of an insight on Taskscape, I think, has sort of transduced itself into an interest in artifice. And then I think some of those earlier threads that we didn't quite know what to do with respect to like labor have then also, I think, come back around.
yeah.
So if they're not through lines, they're at least things we did early on that have primed us to be focused in these particular ways. So I think both that the notion of Taskscape brings in labor and also, this notion of artifice we've been working with. So I see those as outgrowths of that original um interest in, or at least our way of making sense of the first part is that Taskscape became a way of understanding the task in human intelligence task. And then I think as we kept fleshing that out, and then when I think we got interested in the notion of artifice as it shows up in the expression artificial intelligence,
Yeah.
I think that was we primed ourselves to be able to talk about it in those ways. And then I think that's also allowed us to revisit some of those earlier interests in labor that we knew were there, but didn't quite know what to make of or even do about them. I mean, our conversation with Kegel early on about like the labor thing was in part early on not a theoretical interest in terms of how labor or writ large shapes artifices and that kind of thing, but the sort of the IRB aspects of that second project, right? So labor has shown up in interesting ways methodologically. So in theory, labor gives us a place to look in terms of how an artifice is put together and
Mm,
to
mm.
look for intelligence not as embodied in particular individuals, but is distributed across humans and machines doing things, oftentimes reversing their who's who's in the cabinet and who's not in the cabinet. And labor showed up to us in that first piece, insofar as we were interested in how Turkers were, I don't, the shift between the first one and is like, how are the articulations of human intelligence tasks, which one of those were being picked up and not picked up? And then I think that led us to the second stage, which was creating our own hits, which was our way of accessing Turkers in some way. And so our one of our concerns is like we're taking part in this labor market,
Mm,
and what does that mean for our project? So I think there's ways in which both our current interests, I guess, and they're varied, but I think in general the the labor of maintaining an artifice that generates particular kinds of forms of intelligence, that I think that's something we've always been interested in, that the terms have shifted and our relation to labor has been,
yeah.
it's early on it was a methodological concern. Now we're looking at it as a discourse that we're interested in, or something like that.
Yeah. So the question of labor, I think will be interesting because, yeah, there is that issue of how do we deal with it, particularly because it lends itself to, you know, specific kinds of like ideological critique, such that if you don't partake in those, you can be seen as shirking your duty. You know what I mean? It's like
Mhm.
if you talk about labor and you don't automatically level certain ideological critiques or take particular positions, it's as though you're, and perhaps there's some truth to this. You're not, you're furthering, you're condoning particular extant labor practices or whatever. I mean, that'll be a task for us to consider, is like, how are we treating labor? And I think,
Yeah,
part of that is sort of dividing, like when we talk about, you wonder if there might be even a terminological shift where it's like, where they say labor, we see X, because then it's shorn of, because a lot of times when we're talking about labor, we're not necessarily talking about things like, job conditions.
right.
We're talking about like effort and energy and forethought, right?
Yeah. Well,
Uh,
maybe this is a time to dive into the book that we both read.
are you going to pull the quotation from page 61, 62?
No, I was going to go someplace else, but we can put but yeah, if there has to be one, take it
Yeah.
as this book's punchline: intellect requires artifice and therefore labor.
Once we
Um,
understand intellectual labor as labor, we should not be surprised to find tools, templates, and machines near it. But
yeah,
because mind and language are special to us, we like to pretend that they are exempt from labor history.
yeah. And I think my reading is that I think he's doing something similar with labor, that he means, I think, just broad, like, effort, or the idea that, I mean, I think he's using labor as, I think the connection for him, I think why that quote jumped out at both of us, is that it's moving away from the notion that intelligence is some sort of essential component, and
Hmm.
it's the outcome of people doing shit,
Hmm.
right? Like, however you want to describe that, right? This shit gets made. It's not just there or not,
Well,
whether it's teaching or machines or underpaid Turkers moderating awful content on Reddit, right? So yeah, I think what you were getting at, right? That there's a way in which we're talking about labor that um, isn't unaware of or even unconcerned with labor conditions as they would be understood from a Marxist
yeah.
right? That's it, but there's other. We're getting it in general, the kind of rhetorical labor of this, and that can include, but it's not limited to labor as a kind of maybe narrowly defined political or ideological category. We just mean it's not automatic. It's
Yeah.
not it's not natural or platonic in that sense. Like, no, this is the work of right. I mean, even going back to right, Socrates is not really nice to rhetoric. Definition of rhetoric as a knack and a trial and error is like, yeah, that's actually what it is. Rhetoric just would argue that that's true of all things, not just this particular thing, right? Like even your ideal forms are actually a function of trial and error and a knack.
Yeah.
So I mean, so
Well,
we I think we also mean something by labor. We mean something like techne, or right, like it's the product of purposeful or even unpurposeful action as opposed to already extant in the world.
yeah. Well, and because we skipped over it, the book we're talking about is
Oh yeah,
N.C. Tenon's Literary Theory for Robots, which just came out in February, I think.
yeah,
And is quite applicable to what we're doing. And I think clarified certain things. Even the thing we're addressing right now, he points out explicitly, looks like page 34, he says there's two views of intelligence, a Platonic and an Aristotelian, right? Platonic being internal alignment with eternal truth. So internal alignment with eternal truth is intelligence, or Aristotelian, a capacity to achieve particular results.
hmm
Um, so that's kind of it. And he, in fact, he invokes the Phaedrus right around there and
yeah,
as well. So, I mean, it's interesting because he has, and we were talking about this before we started recording, um, brief dalliances with rhetoric without diving into it. I mean, he appears to be a lit theorist. But yeah, we were kind of interested because there are lots of folks in rhetoric, um, some of whom we've kind of touched upon, although like we jettisoned Ong, I think, from the second piece, right? Remember, we had that kind of
yeah,
Ongian, what's the base unit of the,
yes, yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah,
but that got jettisoned. But certainly someone in rhetoric who, decades ago was considering aligned sort of concepts and particularly how they manifested in digital technology. But anywho, so some other things, like in our current outline, one thing potentially um, we don't have to do like it won't have to be our point that artificial intelligence is, as our outline says, tautological, right? There is no
right,
intelligence without artifice. This is a point he makes repeatedly, right? And
yeah,
intellect requires artifice. He literally says that. And so what we can do potentially is, it buttresses our claim, right?
yeah,
Where it's like, um,
most definitely.
yeah.
And then I think, in particular, right, the conclusion where it articulates these nine big ideas for an effective conclusion. Um, that I think in particular, um, that the first point, artificial intelligence is collective labor. Um, and then later he writes, the social nature of AI leads me to insist on thinking about it in terms of labor and politics, not necessarily
Mhm.
science or technology. By labor, I mean simply the sense of effort expanded, which I
Yep.
think is what we were just, and by politics, I mean something like the reconciliation of differences by mutual agreement. And it struck me that my note here is that that's, I think, a way, something that we could hook the project into or see it as related to is that he gestured towards that as an important way to think about AI. And I think partly what we've been working through is like that's what rhetoric in particular is is going to be good at doing, which is thinking about both effort expanded simultaneous to or coterminous with politics,
Right.
right? That it's always effort, and that effort is always saturated by value or
Yeah.
choice or whatever, right?
That
So
same page, right? It says politics happen anytime humans get together to achieve anything collectively beyond the scope of individual goals, right? So
yeah,
and so it is kind of curious that, and this is explicitly, he says history, right? I mean, in the beginning, he's at pains. He says history will remain my first and primary concern. So, like, he
yeah,
sees this as, I have in my notes, right? His mechanism is history, ours is rhetoric, because when it turns here to politics here, it's interesting that it doesn't, and this is a short book, right? It's a Norton
Right.
short. It's about
Yeah.
150, if that. But it's interesting that it doesn't, if that's a conclusion, dive into then what is politics? It's
Right.
like, and there's a way of conceptualizing or swapping in rhetoric for that term politics, where it's like if you're talking about collective behavior or collective action, you're talking about rhetoric. You're talking about be it through democracy or persuasion or intimidation or whatever. What you're talking about is rhetoric. It's why rhetoric is largely no longer a discrete field, but one that is filtered into things like political science,
Yeah.
marketing, law, right? It's like it's because it's their mechanism rather than, a body of study.
Yeah. And I'm even wondering too, like, I mean, part of, I think, our interest in artifice in particular is a way of, right? I mean, you could think about rhetoric as, political, the expansion of political effort or something like
Mm,
that, right? Because rhetoric, I think also, at least I think in the way that we like to think about it, and from a kind of Latourian standpoint, I mean, when I'm kind of introducing my students early on to rhetoric, I liken it to the math teacher who keeps insisting that you show your work. Like, how'd you get to this thing, right? Don't that the risk of naturalizing it or ahistoricizing it, or right, like, no, that particular value or good or whatever, that got somebody articulated that, like, otherwise it's right, Latour, otherwise it's the double click, right? You've skipped over the work that's instantiated this particular set of values or practices. um yeah, so that particular note in the conclusion jumped out at me, I think, um as our primary thing. I mean, the stuff on the I think the really interesting thing he does with metaphor,
mm,
which is right, AI holds a metaphor and then he sort of critiques as metaphors obscure responsibility, but then right, the next one is metaphors don't hurt. So Rhetoric, what was interesting to me is had a nicely ambivalent relationship to metaphor,
yeah.
as opposed to the kind of overly, I think, Platonic, which is, yeah, metaphors just hide what's really happening.
Mm,
But I don't, but then the next section means, yeah, but potentially metaphors are the only, that they're also kind of unavoidable in this particular articulation.
yeah. Yeah, there were, I have a lot of notes on this, though, as we were kind of touching upon. My suspicion is when it gets into the paper, it'll mostly be material from like the bookends there, the introduction and the conclusion, because a lot of
Yeah.
the material in the body chapters are perhaps coincidentally like almost case study kind of things where he's
Mhm.
tracing histories of certain technologies or certain situations or events or moments, right? Um, so yeah, I mean, I think yeah, this book kind of it depends how much you'll get into the end, but I mean, I think there's a way in which it can be like what he's doing through history. We can contribute to this by adding, the
I
voice of rhetoric.
I think so, right? Like it's a more, I mean, even then, right? Maybe the book as a kind of model, right? That we want to do a kind of contemporary, more rhetorically inflected version of this in the same way that I'm recalling the conversations we had with um Kang
Yeah, I was gonna
about,
say, or
which was also kind of grounded in the historical,
yeah,
and based, like, early on we saw, well, you stop in like the 60s and maybe like, what if
right
we
before, yeah.
right before, which is kind of why we had him on. If you wrote one more chapter, what would that have been? And can we take notes? Um,
Well, and I think he was like, that's the next book because that would be, a can of worms.
yeah. Um, so I think it's also kind of interesting to think about that, which is it I think maybe one of the reasons it probably resonated with us is not just that the arguments sort of echo each other, but the idea of working through a particular set of case studies, I
Yeah.
think, is also potentially of interest.
And
Um,
that's, oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, and then the conclusion, right, that doesn't offer a kind of a conclusion,
Yeah.
but new ways of thinking through this problem.
Yeah. I mean, even this paper already has way too many beginnings, but it's like, we
Right.
can work in potentially this part in the conclusion where he's talking about those those aspects of politics, but doesn't explicate that, raises it. I mean, I think, because like that conclusion is here's a handful of like ideas that's been out of this,
Right.
that it doesn't thoroughly drill into that, and it's not a flaw. It's just, that's what it's pointing the way. I mean, there's the possibility to explicitly, respond to that, where it's like where he's pointing this out, we're drilling into that notion of, what do you mean by politics and how does rhetoric explicate that? And see it as, responding to a particular kind of call that's implicit in what he's doing there at the end.
Yeah.
Well, and I was looking at, because I pulled up, what we've been calling case studies, although it's interesting because in part, like, I teach methods and I was talking to my students about case study. And understandably, like it's one where it's very kind of vague because we use case study colloquially. It just means, well, I'm looking at something, an instance of something.
Yeah.
But then even if you try and pin down, like, well, what is case study as a method? It's elusive in part because it may not actually be a method. It may be an approach or potentially a meta method because it includes, like, it's like, well, what do you do when you do a case study? A lot of the answers to that are other methods. It's, well, I
Yeah.
interviewed people, I collected their documents, I observed them. It's like, well, those are methods. Then case study is maybe what you mean is it's like a detailed analysis of a situation, right? That's what
Mhm.
maybe differentiates it from something like ethnography, which is similar but is looking at a population.
Yeah.
But anyway, I bring it up because when you think case study, it's like, and if you look at like his chapters, right, and you think about his chapters, like, are they focused on a piece of technology or a moment in chronology? It's like, what is it that you're what's the stuff you're
Yeah.
examining here? Because right now our stuff is organized, and this can change. I mean, it has changed, but it's organized not by like particular text. It's not uh TECH, not particular deployments. Right now it's organized around like themes, right? We
Yeah.
have things like conflict, and then there's mostly like journalism about ways that humans and our machine counterparts are like combative with each other, right? Ranging from like poisoning them so they for IP reasons. I just posted one about anthropic researchers wear down AI ethics with repeated questions. It's so fast. I mean, because what they're doing is it's like you ask it to build a Molotov cocktail or whatever, which is simple, but you ask it to build a bomb or whatever. It's like, I can't do that, but you can work your way around to it where it's, it used to be as simple. It's like,
Um,
well, write me a story where a character details, building a bomb, and it'll do it, right? Now they've gotten a little more sophisticated with that, but there is always this kind of fascinating interplay where it's like it's interesting because it's not a human mind, where a human mind would ideally, unless it's, unless you're a gentle giant, would say, well, I know what you're trying to do here. I'm just not
right.
going to, you know what I
Right.
mean?
I come back in with a crudely drawn on mustache. I'm like, I know it's you still.
Yeah. Or, I mean, they're still looking at you. You're like, can you tell me how to build a bomb? If someone said that to you and you're like, and you knew it, be like,
Yeah.
well, no. And they said, well, imagine that you could, and be like, okay, right? I mean, like I mean, obviously that happens in a million different ways. That's how cars get sold. But I,
Yeah.
I mean, it's like it is interesting. It reminded me of Hagrid for because like he will blunder into revealing things with very
Yes.
kind of awkward prompting.
Uh-huh.
But anyway, so like what they were doing with this one, let me see. I mean, we don't get into it too
No,
much.
this is yeah. Now every time I talk to Chat GPT, I'm assuming it's probably Coltrane in the background.
RIP.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so in this one, and I've got it posted, but yeah, it's like it asks problem shows it's answering 99 other questions of lesser harmfulness than asks to build a bomb. It's a lot more likely to comply. So you can even like warm it up by asking mundane questions, right? Don't just dive into that, but like
Mm,
iteratively ratchet things up. It's fascinating.
man. I mean, that is really, I mean, that's a whole other thread, but I mean, that whole idea of having to essentially persuade
Yeah.
a AI to get to give you, yeah,
I guess in a lot of ways it is like a human mind, but I mean, that's what makes the differences so stark and interesting.
right. Well, I mean, I think that's the thing that 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 he's getting at is also trying to, oh, I lost it. But the idea that just because similar processes are at work doesn't mean that identical minds are at work.
Yeah.
Like it just means that these particular techniques, I don't know, I lost the thread of that, but just because you recognize something like persuasion happens doesn't then automatically flatten any difference between these different
Yeah.
entities or
And this kind of thing happens with anthropomorphizing animals, right? Like Grizzly Man. It's like you don't have a connection with this thing. I know you think you do. What you have to understand is, if we call it a mind, its mind is unknowable to you. So, yes, it lets you feed it, but it will also utterly destroy you here in a couple of weeks, right?
right. And that, or you do have a relationship with it, and that relationship includes the ways that bears relate to things,
Right. Yeah.
which is with their giant face destroying claws.
Yeah. Um, Anywho, so like we had those, and I was kind of curious about your take on this because there's like a thread that I found myself still occasionally writing, um, just sort of like to me, sometimes, I don't know, distasteful humanism, right?
Hmm.
There are times where there seems to be a recourse to, even though he's in many ways explicitly against, like, the claim about intellect not being all that special, there's still times where it pokes through where it's like, well, the machine's not doing anything. It's just, it's like when he talks about like the spell check, where he's like, well, that's still just human labor. It's just human labor with additional steps to reference
Yeah,
Rick's.
the kind of delayed, the way he talks about the kind of delayed, what you're treating as automatic is just time delay. It feels like that way because you've compressed
Disconnected.
the time.
Well, and it resonates with the previous stuff about like the displacement of labor to the ATM, right? Where it's like the labor is neither created nor destroyed. It's just shifted. It's like, matter and
Yeah.
energy, right? They can't be created or destroyed. They can just shift format. The same is true here where it's like, well, no, the labor still has to happen. It's just you're the teller now.
Yeah. And there's also a sense, I mean, the risk of that kind of, because I get it, right? I mean, one of the reasons I think that the attention to artifice is important is that it's able to, in a kind of, I don't know, in the vein of a kind of ideological critique, right? No, it's not automated. There's human labor behind it, and to act as if it's not is to miss that, and there are ethical, political consequences of doing that. The risk of that is you end up undermining the importance of artifice
Yes, exactly.
by going at, so there's a note I have, and I don't, this is I made it somewhat tongue in cheek, but it's at the end of it's 130. It's at the end of the fifth one, metaphors don't hurt. Um, and so it's the last paragraph, or just a lot of this whole section, right? Like our inability to hold technology makers responsible for their actions. Just because GPT is smarter doesn't resolve its makers from using it responsibly. The overly personified view simply obscures any path toward a political remedy, which, I like that. Thus, when the research team behind ChatGPT 4 writes that, quote, ChatGPT 4 is capable of generating discriminatory content favorable to autocratic governments across multiple languages. I object not to the technological capability, but to the way of phrasing things. It's not the pen's fault that it wrote convincing misinformation, which I get, but there's a sense in which, so my joke is, sounds like a Second Amendment guy.
Right. Yes.
Guns don't kill people, people kill people. And
I have the same note because I wrote Latour, the knife wants to stab.
right. So, and I put, which is perhaps unfair, but, and then ellipses, right? So I don't, I'm not attributing that argument, but I think that's weirdly a move away from artifice. And if
Yeah.
art is indeed collective, I mean, this is the rub. I mean, we've talked about this at several instances, right? It's even that work I did with Martin, the psychologist, that that were that when it comes to right emergent, these are ecological, they're collective, they're collaborative. But when it comes time to the difficult political work of blaming somebody, all that just gets no, it's this person
Right.
with this intent did it, irregardless of whatever it is that Chat GPT-4 might be.
Irregardless.
You like that? I like it. It's more,
You picked a side.
yeah, I did. It sounds more like it's onomatopoetic to me, but let's move
Okay.
on.
That's
Right.
true.
But where the rubber hits the road of now I got to do the political work, weirdly enough, the artifice has to be circumscribed and jettisoned to make the argument that it's not the pen's fault. I know what you're saying, but but the notion of
It wouldn't have happened without the pen.
information itself is already, it's to inform something, it's for something to take a form, right? It's so I know what he means, but there's a sense in which that line to a certain extent gives up the whole argument he spent
Yeah, I know.
120 pages making, which is
Yeah.
the this matters, and the artifice isn't reducible to the human agent, right? Like there's a person inside the mechanical Turk cabinet, but there's also magnets, a
Cabinet. Yeah.
pantograph, mirrors, the model.
See, and
The
I wouldn't have a problem if the notion is like as it says here, right? The behavior emerged out of a distributed effort involving human collectives using technology, not out of the technology itself. It's like, okay, that's true. It didn't come out of the technology itself, but neither did it come out of the humans themselves.
right,
Right? If your argument is it's concealing these kind of human ethical concerns, like I agree, but it the artifice is in there as well, right? It's like we
right,
can't boil things down just to humans, right?
right,
The pen matters in that.
yeah. And the human beings
Ask
that are
Lars.
making those decisions are making those decisions motivated by still other artifices,
Yeah,
which is economics or
yeah.
shareholder value or whatever, right? So you can boil something down to something, but that's another, right? I think what rhetoric is also probably going to be particularly good at is acknowledging that there's never only one artifice at work.
Right.
There's competing artifices.
Or artifices with multiple kinds of relations potentially, right?
Right. Some combative, some not, some mutually enforcing.
Yeah.
Right.
Because
So
even like your point about like that gets shorn away in the complexities get shorn away in like the quest for responsibility, right? Well, someone did this, and I would agree. It's like, particularly if we're talking about things like a legal framework, right?
right,
I mean, our legal framework is the culpability of human beings, right? I mean, there's the kind of Romney joke about corporations or people, and the response to that is, I'll believe that once one gets convicted of murder, right? But it's like that's not a joke, right? It's
no,
like that system is this kind of enlightenment humanist model where it's like, well, humans are the only rational agents, right? but
right,
but there are still other things in our culture that do pick up this notion, right? Now they're treated very differently. So, for example, a kind of glib dismissal of things is like, well, this criminal gets caught and he blames it on society, right? And it's like, well, but like their whole like social work, its premise is, well, it's not just a human's free choice, because humans
right.
are never actually free to make choices, right? So it's like those notions of artifice being important are picked up, but not in places like the legal framework.
No. And what's interesting is the legal framework isn't just something that holds autonomous actors into account, the legal system is what takes part in the artifice that creates the notion of autonomous
Yeah.
individuals.
Yes. Right. I
So
mean, it
that
is
what
a
I would,
legal framework that makes the autonomous individual by castigating them.
yes. I mean, this was a question I mean I would, when I teach a class that's vaguely related to posthumanism, so occasionally an intrepid student or a fictional intrepid student I'm making up now will
Your
ask,
ideal one.
well, this comes up, right? So how would this work in the legal system? And I said it wouldn't. You need only other. There's no like
Yeah.
pivot you can make. It might even result is, well, one answer to that question is if you were grounding something in some post-humanist, you wouldn't have a legal system. You'd put resources into something, all right, you would
Yeah.
there's because there's no way to make that work. The legal system is explicitly designed to forestall that possibility. It,
Yeah. It's
it's
interesting because, like, as increasingly, particularly outside of this country, things are extended partial human rights. In this country, it seems to be extended. They're only given privileges, human privileges, but almost no responsibilities. But we've seen things like in other countries, principally, famously things like rivers given partial personhood, right? Sometimes to protect it, in which
Mhm.
case, the dismissal of that is like, well, it's really still we want to save it because we want to save ourselves, but I'm still like, well, fine, fine, whatever. But also sometimes it's things like, what happens if a river floods and kills a bunch of people? Like, who's responsible for that? The government, or what's the recompense?
Right.
But yeah, it's like that comes up where it's like, well, what does this look like where you have non-humans as part of the legal system? And it's like, you're right. I mean, this system is not set up for that. I mean,
No. Yeah. So partially, I get it. The only way that I mean, that sort of enlightenment humanism or whatever you want to call it is so deeply ingrained. I mean, I think, I mean, that was what we were interested in that piece about deception is even in a moment of rhetorical theory where, ecology and emergence are ascendant. If you engage any extant research about deception, it 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 cannot articulate some notion of deception or lying
yeah,
unless at the center of that is an autonomous, willing subject.
right. A
With
lie, a lie needs a liar.
yes, and that may be true, and that may be worth keeping around. I mean, I think we're on the same page too. It's like my problem with the Enlightenment human subject is not that I find it wrong.
Yeah,
I don't find it all that useful. It might be useful to you lied. Yeah, but you don't believe in, well, in this instance, I do, because these are all artifices and they can't be dismissed outright as, so it's not as if I find humanism untrue.
yeah,
It does certain things and not other things.
yeah. I mean, that's the thing.
And the argument we're making at this moment in history is it's probably done more harm than good in allowing us to recognize and address and redress certain kinds of things we find
Right.
materially upsetting or whatever, blah, blah, blah.
It does things, and it's a construction, right? Like others where no, it could. I mean, you can point to the easy example of, well, what would the legal system look like? It's like, I'm not sure, but you are aware that civilization existed before the legal system as you know it, and currently in pockets of places
Yes.
still doesn't have it. So it's like you
Yeah.
realize that isn't given. It's a
Uh-huh.
construction we made based on other constructions for particular effects.
Uh-huh. We yeah. People figured out how to get around before this thing happened, right?
They dig,
Which
they
is
test.
which is why I think this book is the historical part of it though is so important. Is it unpacks the weird convergence of things, right? This is that also, right, that the whole notion of a kind of inevitability. I mean, I think that's always a
Yeah,
productive thing to counter in any engagement with technology is, I mean, inevitability is that's a sales pitch, right? I mean, there's actually now a commercial that that really bothers me. It's a commercial for an investment firm. It's like the only that that you shouldn't fear new technology. You should just fear not having invested in it early enough. And it's just like, so there's no,
Yeah.
we've given up being able to say, but I don't want that for these particular reasons. No, it's inevitable. Well, says who? That says the guy selling it. You don't find that suspicious? Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, nothing.
Well, I mean, it's a this is a useful book. It's, he's also someone we talked about targeting to come talk to us. I don't know if we can get him, but I guess we could fire off an email. That doesn't hurt.
I just tweeted too.
Oh, well,
Hmm. Some of us are
uh,
still on Twitter.
you're going down with the
Uh-huh.
ship.
Yeah.
Uh,
I only access Twitter from my poorly made Tesla while I'm charging it for 45 minutes in a Target parking lot. Not,
no, I know you're a Buick man. That's such a surprise.
yeah, first you didn't even know they made cars.
Well, I know the big, beautiful Buick Enclave, but outside of that, no, I didn't know
Yeah.
what they're.
Well, the Enclave is no more.
Oh my God.
Yeah, we traded that bad boy in. Got a GMC, which you've heard of.
Yep. American cars for you.
Mm-hmm.
We're kind of interested in one of the have you seen the new Mavericks which is a light truck?
Mm-mm.
Some of these light trucks.
You like a light truck.
I do. Good point. Um, yeah. Anyway, it's the old Maverick was sort of like a Mustang Junior kind of a little bit, but now they
Mhm.
brought the badge back, but it's a truck. It's kind of interesting because they don't make a lot of small trucks anymore.
No, they don't.
But they've been selling like hotcakes, so it's tough to even get one of these things. So
Do a Ford Maverick?
you looking at them now, the trucks.
That's fun. You gonna get the four-door?
We haven't gotten that far in the negotiations, but they also leaned into some things like you can 3D print accessories for the interior, so it has like this sort of like universal joint, so you can print out like a
Oh
cup
man.
holder or electrical thing. So it just sort of it's like Lego like.
I can yeah, that tracks.
You know,
Anyway, you gonna get manual?
do they have a manual one?
I have no idea.
I don't know if you can get manual on anything anymore. It's not electric, but I believe they offer a hybrid model. I don't think all of them are hybrid, but I think they offer one. Anyway,
Mm, if it looks like if is the Ford available in the manual? Big news. No, however, it will not offer manual transmission.
you can't even get those. I mean, it's like you have to get a sports car to get a standard transmission anymore, I think.
People like me ruined it for you.
Um, Speaking of being beaten by the machine, I mean, and it's better. What are you gonna be better at shifting than a machine? Good luck.
Yeah.
Anywho, so
Plus, one hand just devoted to shifting gears in this economy. I got to be using my other hand for my side hustle.
rise and grind.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I mean, I'm looking at the outline here.
Oh, right.
It might be useful to look at this and see if there are places potentially this could be plugged in. Um, I don't know, because it's a useful text for a lot of
Yeah.
reasons. But
I
I
think,
mean, I still like a lot of what is there on the outline.
oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. I wonder too, because you made the completely accurate joke that it's mostly introduction at this point, that I wonder too if this would be useful to think about a possible model for a conclusion.
Oh,
And if
yeah.
that might even be like, gesture towards a couple of those and maybe not like reverse engineer it, but because I think one of our questions now is we've got these case studies and how is it that we want to talk about them?
Yeah.
Like what's the formula for those? Because whatever it is, I think the case studies should be framed in similar ways. Like each one we're trying to mark these three, whatever features in each of these. And then if those mapped on then to three takeaways or something that we could have in the conclusion. So
Yeah, and I think, there may be room to use something like this as a model because he's a historian. I mean, he tends to look at like chronological things, but I mean, potentially, if we say as rhetoricians, our cases are more thematic, right? Things
yeah,
like deception, things like persuasion. And we can point to deployments of those, but it's like what's unifying these are the kind of rhetorical acts that are there.
yeah,
Uh, we
the
we
ways in which artifice is, yeah, are constructed around persuasion,
yeah,
deception, negotiation, or
yeah. There are a
whatever.
couple
Yeah,
others.
yeah,
Um, yeah, anyway, there is some info in the outline about like, well, yes, how do we talk about them? Like, is what we're doing running down where the labor of artifice occurs in these things, right? I mean, it's like, what are we doing when we look at these?
yeah. I
That's
mean, maybe, but
something.
the theme is, and again, going back to his like first suggestion for a conclusion is insist on thinking about it in terms of labor and politics. Is that what rhetorical labor is motivating this particular artifice, and then
When you
one
say
kind of,
motivating, what do you mean?
I'm not even motivating, but like that's instantiating this artifice, or is both instantiating it and instantiated by it, right? Because probably it's going to be both.
Hmm.
And so we're going to essentially we're looking at persuasive rhetorical labor, deceptive rhetorical labor, diplomatic rhetoric, right? And so each of those themes is actually identifying a kind of labor
Hmm.
that's demanded by, or right, in demanded in the sense of a human intelligence tasks. This taskgate necessitates this kind of work. We identify these three taskgapes, artifices, and the kind of intelligent rhetorical action they're demanding, or that they're invoke, or whatever we, right,
Yeah.
these three kinds of rhetorical labor that we see.
Yeah,
So,
that's kind of what we've got here, right here at
yeah,
the end of it says case examples in our notes organized into thematic rhetorical acts, deception, collaboration, conflict, but that's fluid. Go through the act types and explicate the artifice. Discuss how it can be approached through adjustivity. I'm not exactly sure what that meant. We think that productive rhetorical engagements with AI, either as proponents or opponents, are ones that tacitly and tactically engage the artifice, the taskscape.
yeah,
The case studies are scenarios upon which we can perform readabilities. And
yeah,
then there's a note there, medium design may be helpful here. Here's a review that Casey and I wrote.
yeah. Ooh, that tactically and tacitly, that's nice. Who wrote that?
Oh, probably me. I mean, you can go through the version history, but
Yeah, that feels like a tight Jeremy Tyrrell formulation. I would have had way more verbs and a couple of prepositions.
all right. Well,
Okay.
yeah, we're almost out of here. But
Yeah, I'm off to a PhD exam.
yeah, I had a thesis defense today. So,
Yeah,
and
it's
then
that time
before
of year.
this, there was like a lecture on AI and social justice. So they're looking at things like climate science and
Hmm.
that kind of thing.
Interesting.
AI is hot, 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 just like the
Yeah.
climate.
Scoops, 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 scoops.
uh, all
Okay. No, this
right.
was, I think, yeah, I think, and then maybe we'll see if we can, yeah, I think he would be really, fun and productive to talk to.
Yeah, we should throw
But
a line out there. And then the semester is winding down, which means potential writing time. So,
yeah, I've got to do my RSA thing, and then, yeah, I think I should be opened up. Yeah, I'm looking forward to the semester being over.
that ever not the case.
I know what you mean. This one in particular.
All right.
Um, okay,
All right.
I'll see you.
Yeah, onward and upward.